over the course of the last few decades, a new ideology has become very influential on parts of the left, a form of identitarianism on the left that's often called wokeness. By what right are you excluding us from the principles, from the aspirations that this society has written into its founding documents? We are fighting for inclusion under those values, under those norms. And that is historically how we've made tremendous progress. So we're listening to our fellow citizens raise concerns about this. But that doesn't mean that, in any conversation saying, well, I'm of this group and my lived experience is X, and therefore here are the consequences we should take. That is just not the way that good argument works.
Welcome to The Contrarian. I'm David Bernstein. In a world filled with noise, I'm here to provide the signal. Hi, welcome to The Contrarian. I'm your host, David Bernstein. With us today is Yascha Mounk, one of the public intellectuals I admire the most, who's been, I think, extremely important voice in the current discussion around ideology and our current polarizing moment. Yascha, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
And I want to thank you for your book, The Identity Trap. I think it's a marvelous book. I wholly recommend it. In fact, I've been asking my entire staff team to read it. I think it's also the most accessible and succinct intellectual history of where we are today. And this ideology, I know you call it the identity synthesis. We'll talk a little bit about that, about where we are today and how it came to be and why we're fighting some of the battles that we're fighting today. So I couldn't appreciate it more.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful to hear. I hope your staff won't hate you for having to read the book.
Well, they had to read The Constitution of Knowledge by John Roush, so yours is actually even easier to read through. So in this moment, I would love to get your sort of Reader's Digest version of why we're at the current moment. What are some of those intellectual trends that you talked about in The Identity Trap that brought us to this current moment?
I mean, broadly speaking, I think that the left used to be deeply invested in universalist and humanist values. I was attracted to the left as a young person because I thought that it was the political direction that emphasized what we have in common as human beings, what connects us, the ways in which we can communicate and have empathy for each other across the lines of race, religion, ethnicity, language, and so on. And I think that over the course of the last few decades, a new ideology has become very influential on parts of the left, a form of identitarianism on the left that's often called wokeness, that I tend to call the identity synthesis, which denies all of these ideas, that says that if you stand at a different intersection of identities to me, I'm not going to be able to truly understand you. That if I'm influenced by the cultures of some other group, if I'm inspired by it to have some form of artistic creation of my own that draws on those influences. That isn't one of the positive features of a diverse society like the United States. It is something to worry about in the shape of cultural appropriation. And that rather than trying to make progress towards a fairer, better society that overcomes the forms of discrimination that certainly still exist by endeavoring to treat people as equals, and for the state to ensure that it treats all of us fairly, irrespective of our identity groups. It is saying that actually we should make identity a bigger and bigger part of social reality, that how I treat you should depend on the particular identities that you hold, and how the state should treat all of us should depend on the group into which we belong. That is not going to make a more tolerant society. It's going to encourage forms of zero-sum conflict between different ethnic and religious blocs, and I'm very concerned about it.
I want to explore some of the terminology, and like you've been struggling to find words that convey what we're trying to, but without entering even more polarized discourse. One of them has been term identity politics. And I think it's an important term, but sometimes I think it's used too broadly, like so many of these terms. Here's what I mean. There are different tribes and groups of people. They don't have to be ethnic identities. They could be, bikers, or I'm an owner of a Mini Cooper, and I learned that there's a whole tribe of people who own Mini Coopers, right? And they go to, and they congregate at parks and so forth. And those people have interests. and they get together and they sometimes lobby the state. If you're a trout fisherman, you want cleaner waters, right? And it seems to me that, if that identity groups like, African Americans, the Latinos, to the degree that they're actually a monolithic group, or Jews or anybody else, can legitimately say we've got grievances and we want to lobby for ourselves, and that there's nothing inherently wrong. And if there was something wrong with it, then the entire civil rights enterprise would have been wrong, because it was a group saying that we have problems with society and we want something different. Yet it seems to me that there are forms of identity politics worth opposing. And how do you distinguish those worth opposing and those that we consider completely legitimate part of our politics?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I agree exactly with your premise that, in a deeply diverse society, you're going to have forms of identity politics. One of the biggest associations in the United States is the AARP, the American Association for Retired People. It's a kind of identity, right, based on age. I don't always agree with everything that the AARP does in terms of its political lobbying, but it's certainly legitimate for there to be an association saying we're going to stand up for the interests of older Americans. That's a normal part of politics in a pluralistic society. Even when it comes to forms of ethnic identity politics, especially in cases where groups have historically been discriminated against, I think it's understandable to say we're going to band together and organize for our interests to make sure that we don't suffer discrimination. In a very broad sense of what identity politics might entail, some of the figures I most admire in American history, from Frederick Douglass to Martin Luther King Jr., engaged in identity politics. But the crucial distinction between them and the forms of identity politics that are unfortunately taking over on big parts of the left today is the goal, is the vision for the society we want to create. Frederick Douglass, in his famous speech about the 4th of July, called out the hypocrisy of his fellow citizens, saying, you're talking about all men being created equal and celebrating these words in the Declaration of Independence at a time when my brethren are still enslaved. You're hypocrites. But he did not say, therefore, rip up the Constitution, rip up the Declaration of Independence. He said, if you're serious about these values, then you have to live up to them. Then you have to actually implement them. Then you have to free the slaves. Then you have to fight for emancipation. Martin Luther King Jr. said that the check written by the Bank of Justice has always been fraudulent. It was never cashed. But he didn't say rip up the check. He said you need to honor the check. You need to honor your promises to African Americans. So that is a form of universalist identity politics. It is saying, by what right are you excluding us from the principles, from the aspirations that this society has written into its founding documents? We are fighting for inclusion under those values, under those norms. And that is historically how we've made tremendous progress. It is how African Americans have made incomplete but tremendous progress over history. And it's, by the way, why the gay rights movement was so successful in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. You mentioned Jonathan Raucher earlier and his wonderful book, The Constitution of Knowledge. Jonathan was one of the first people to write in support of gay marriage in a national magazine in the United States, along with people like Andrew Sullivan. And what Jonathan will tell you is that one of their first fights was within the gay rights movement, because those people were saying, we don't want to get married. That's a bourgeois, heterosexual institution. Rip up the institution. We want to fight. And he said, no, to make progress, we need to ask for inclusion in those institutions. We need to ask people, how is our love different from that of a heterosexual couple? But by what right, by what virtue should we not enjoy the same protections, the same blessings from society? That is how we've made tremendous progress on gay and lesbian rights. The problem with the new ideology we're talking about today is that it consists in the rejection of those ideas. But it goes right back to its founding members. Derek Bell, very thoughtful legal scholar, very interesting figure that I admire a lot in many ways, explicitly thought that Brown versus Board of Education was in many ways a mistake, that perhaps we should have had schools that were separate but truly equal. That is a rejection of the universalism that good forms of identity politics have always remained based on.
It seems to me that there's another form of identity politics related to what you're saying that's worth rejecting as well. And it's what's sometimes called standpoint epistemology. Actually, I wrote my first article, or maybe my only article on standpoint epistemology for Persuasion, your publication. And it argues that my positionality as an ethnic community, a marginalized community, gives me privileged knowledge, gives me insight that I wouldn't otherwise have, and that the rest of society should be obligated to listen to, not just listen to, but defer to in a way. But I've always felt that problematic, and I've tried, as somebody who's concerned about anti-Semitism, I wrote a book about anti-Semitism, not to do the same thing myself. In other words, do Jews get to define anti-Semitism? I tend to argue, no, we don't. We get to have a voice in it, and you should hear out our voice, but it's still, there are other data points besides my lived experience as a Jewish person, which may differ from your lived experience as a Jewish person, that we should consider when defining what anti-Semitism is. It's tricky because there have to be societal definitions that law enforcement can use and so forth. But still, at least in a larger sense, I don't get to have a monopoly over how anti-Semitism is defined. Nobody does. It's a liberal society. And I think that it seems to me that might be one form of identity politics worth rejecting as well. What do you think?
Yes, no, I agree completely. So 2 points on this, right? Of course, the idea behind standpoint epistemology is that where we stand influences what we perceive. And in certain ways, that is, of course, true, right? I'm aware of the fact that as somebody who reads as white, I reject that self-definition, but somebody who certainly appears white to the average person on the street in the United States, I haven't had certain kinds of experiences of police discrimination or police violence that not every African American has had, but that African Americans are much more likely to have in our society, right? And so when I listen to Black friends or colleagues or strangers, saying, I don't trust the police for this and that reason, it would be tempting for me to say, well, I don't know, I've never experienced what you're talking about. I'm going to discount that. And of course, that would be wrong, right? I need to take that seriously as a testimony to aspects of my social reality that I may not be fully conscious of, right? But there are a few mistakes that the people who believe in a strong version of standpoint epistemology go on to make. The first of them is to think that subjective experience rules and determines everything, that you can make policy on the basis of just those kinds of subjective experience. But of course, while we need to be attentive to subjective experience, we also need to have data and analytical questioning of points of view and all of those kinds of things. Now, they are rooted in lived experience, right? If I know from talking to African Americans that many of them complain about police violence, but let's go and really study police violence. And one of the reasons why we're doing that is that we're listening to our fellow citizens raise concerns about this. But that doesn't mean that, in any conversation saying, well, I'm of this group and my lived experience is X, and therefore here are the consequences we should take. That is just not the way that good argument works, and it's not the way that sensible argument works in a free society.
Yeah.
The second problem with this is the implication that somehow you are unable to understand the political upshot of what I'm saying. Now, again, I may never truly know what it feels like to walk in the shoes of somebody who, is stopped and frisked all of the time, right? I may never truly inhabit the sense of dejection and anger that would reasonably provoke in a lot of people. But I certainly can say, I've listened to you, and I've looked at the statistics, and I see that this happens a lot more to Black and Latino people than to white people. And you know what? Based on my own values, based on my own ideas about what's right and wrong, I reject that. And so I'm going to stand in solidarity with you. I don't want to live in a society where you're more likely to experience that form of treatment than I am, just on the basis of the color of your skin. So the politically salient upshot of these first-person experiences is usually communicable, even if not every aspect of that lived experience is. And finally, I just want to say one more thing, because you touched a little bit on how Jews should respond to this, right? And I think that the strange situation for Jews at the moment is that, especially in progressive spaces like college campuses, there have come to be these protected victim classes. The student ID at New York University has 3 numbers on it. The first to call in case of a medical emergency, the second to call in case there's a terror attack or some kind of threat to public safety, and the third to call in case there's a microaggression. And in those kind of discourses, microaggressions against African Americans, against Latinos, against trans people, against various kinds of groups count for a lot. And often microaggressions against Jews don't count for a lot, or explicitly don't count at all. And there's many DEI offices around the country that explicitly say that Jews do not count as part of a customer base because they're privileged rather than underprivileged. And that, of course, raises two potential courses of action for Jews, right? One is to say, hey, there's these restrictions on free speech that apply to all these different groups, but not to Jews. We want the same restrictions, right? It's to say, hey, there's all of these victim groups that have been recognized as being particularly vulnerable and that get special treatment as a result. We want the same special treatment, right? And I think that that's a mistake. It's a mistake in practical terms, because then you're still making the way you're going to be treated depend on the goodwill of whatever administrator happens to be in charge on a college campus or whatever authority happens to be in charge outside of campus. So you're still vulnerable to the fleeting goodwill of the mainstream of society. And secondly, I think it's wrong on principled grounds. It's wrong because the way to build a free society, the kind of society in which Jews have flourished, is to live up to our universal values that include values like free speech.
Yeah. So we've been struggling a lot with that lately, as you can imagine. And there's an argument. Let me play devil's advocate for a while, because I agree with you, but there is an argument made by very thoughtful people who would rather have free speech than an emphasis on equal protection. But the equal protection argument goes like this. It says, look, universities, many of which are private, are not subject to the First Amendment. They have very strict speech codes. They have microaggression policies. And therefore, they must exercise equal protection in their treatment of the Jewish community, or they are, A, they're violating a law, but B, equal protection, like free expression, is actually a liberal value, that we treat everybody equally. And there's a sort of a twist on this argument that I think is interesting. And they say, furthermore, if they are forced to include Jews in the mix of marginalized communities, the weight of the contradiction, in a way, is going to bring down the entire enterprise, and many of them will ultimately opt for free expression because they just don't want to extend that to any group that's considered white passing. Now, again, that's a bet that I think we'd be making that I'm not sure is worth making. But what do you think of that counter argument?
Look, I certainly think that Jews should call attention to the hypocrisy and call attention to, if somebody said X, you would immediately throw them off campus. But if somebody says this about Jews, suddenly it's okay. And that was quite effective. I mean, it was effective in leading directly or indirectly to the resignation of two presidents of major universities. I don't think that in order to call attention to that hypocrisy, in order to put pressure on the obvious unfairness of a current situation, you need to go as far as to advocate for, just an expansion of the deeply flawed system we have now that includes Jews. And I'm always conscious, and this is part of intellectual history, of the origins of the identity synthesis, actually, because many of the people who theorized it, who made great contributions to it, would be horrified by the form that the ideology now takes of, the phrase "careful what you wish for." The idea is to put some kind of jujitsu move where we advocate for those special group rights for Jews as well, but I'm sure they're not going to want that, and so in the end, that's how we get to universalism. Well, perhaps and perhaps not. Perhaps we end up in a society in which we go even further towards, the way you're treated, the rights and duties you have, depending on the particular group you're from. And that is, of course, what, in a sense, has been the Jewish predicament for much of our history. And there was often decades, and sometimes in certain places centuries, where that treated us relatively well, and then suddenly public opinion shifted, and we no longer had any rights, and we had a lot of restrictions and duties and forms of discrimination on the basis of that group. The only type of society in which Jews or other ethnic and religious minorities have consistently flourished are societies in which the way you're treated does not depend on the group of which you are part.
Yeah. Governor Abbott of Texas yesterday, I think it might have been an executive order, basically said that he instructed, I think it was his Department of Education in Texas, to protect Jewish students and find ways in which to sort of subvert the freedom of expression on campus. And your one-time debate partner, Chris Rufo, who I don't always agree with, tweeted out, I thought correctly, that this is as much as he wants to support efforts to curb anti-Semitism on campus, he thinks this is a violation. And I have to say, I agree with him as well. I think that sort of oversteps the bounds of government. And I think it does reinforce the very ideological terms that are causing the problem in the first place. I mean, if the oppressed oppressor binary that we're talking about here is the root cause of some of the anti-Semitism that we're seeing on campuses and other progressive institutions, then I would think that you'd want to fight it at that level and not just try to get your best deal in the present.
And it's a mistake that the left has made, right? I mean, the left, when it didn't feel like it was in power, was pro-free speech. That's why in the 60s, the Berkeley free speech movement was a left-wing cause, because it felt that the people making decisions in universities and other places about what you can say weren't on their side, right? I mean, it's always the people with power who are tempted to crack down on free speech. And so why has the left started to embrace a rejection of free speech over the last decades, particularly in progressive spaces like campuses? Because they came to assume that really they're in charge, that the kind of administrator who's going to make a decision about what is allowed under the speech code and what is not allowed under the speech code is going to share their political sensibilities, right? And now, since October 7th, I actually think that there's been, to some extent, legitimate concerns among those groups that some of what they want to say now suddenly is being shut down in certain places by government policy, like in Texas, as you're saying. Now, to me, that has a little bit of an element of shocked Pikachu face, right? It's like, oh no, right. How come that the kind of restrictions that we advocated for, I thought it was only the bad people that are going to be punished, but I wasn't ever going to be punished by it because I'm supposedly the good person who's always on the side of the right? But that is the problem, right? That asking for restrictions on free speech can seem like a smart power move in certain political constellations, but political constellations change. And the only way to make sure that you can actually say your piece is to make it independent of political constellations. And that is by maintaining a principled case for free speech. And so I think Jews should be very, very wary about assuming that, perhaps because right now in Texas, the governor genuinely, I don't know if that's true, but let's assume that right now the governor genuinely seems to be concerned for the well-being of Jewish students at universities in Texas. I have some reasons to doubt the genuineness of a concern, but let's acknowledge it for the sake of argument. But who knows who the next governor and the governor after that is going to be? Who knows how a political constellation is going to change? This is not a way to securely base our rights and our protections in a free society.
So I mentioned Chris Rufo in passing there, but you had this, I think, very good debate on Barry Weiss's podcast. A week doesn't go by where somebody doesn't send me a link to it. And so I think it really has shown the sort of fault lines between, center-left liberals and maybe right of center. I don't know if he would consider himself a classical liberal, perhaps not in many senses. But I want to steel man him for a second, because I thought it was I think he makes a point that I want to try out on you in a little bit different language. I think Chris Rufo has a point about politics, that public intellectuals writing great op-eds and it's not enough, that political power is a necessary ingredient in trying to change some of these deeply structural problems in universities. Now, I don't want Florida or Texas to pass divisive concepts legislation that are probably unconstitutional, will never hold up anyway. And I thought it was interesting in that debate. It was the first time I've ever heard him say it. When you challenged him on that and didn't let him off the hook, he himself acknowledged that was not something that he wanted in the original legislation, and that actually was thrust upon him by legislators in the process. I thought that was fascinating. But there are efforts that I at least consider legitimate. A governor or a state banning DEI bureaucracies in state universities. That's an act of state power. It seems to me that it's defensible and maybe even warranted. What is your take on that?
Yeah, so look, I certainly think that it's appropriate for legislators to set boundaries on what receives public funding, for example, right? I mean, there's a crucial distinction between private universities and public universities, and then there's a second distinction between what universities should be allowed to do on their own dime, and what kind of conditions we should attach to federal funding. And in fact, already there are extremely onerous conditions on federal funding that exist, some of which I think are actually quite illiberal. So we're already in that world. So I certainly wouldn't say that any form of a state legislature trying to influence the nature of universities in their state, or even what private universities are able to do with federal funding, is per se illegitimate. But I think the goal of that always has to be to create, recreate, or preserve a genuine culture of free expression. So to put conditions on federal funding of private universities or on state funding of public universities that make sure that, if a university doesn't maintain free speech norms which allow people of diverse ideological backgrounds to actually have a say on campus, if they in some way discriminate against students on the basis of their political views, if they discriminate against faculty on the basis of their political views, they're going to forfeit significant amounts of funding. That to me is perfectly appropriate, right? That's the use of state power actually in the service of free speech. The argument that, despite his very interesting concession, which you point to, I took Chris Rufo to be making, and the argument that certainly seems to be at the bottom of the actual legislation advanced in Florida and many of these other states, is a little bit different, right? It's to say, at Harvard, we don't feel comfortable. We don't get to have our say. It's a place that discriminates against our points of view, which, by the way, I think is fair and is a problem. But as a result, where we have political power, we're going to make sure that the people on the other side aren't able to say their piece, aren't able to advance their ideas, right? And that then leads us to the genuine danger of, having one orthodoxy at Harvard where, you can't express certain views, and, a different countervailing orthodoxy at the University of Florida where you can't express different kinds of views. And that is not a healthy landscape of higher education. And a healthy landscape of higher education, Harvard might lean left or progressive, but conservatives are going to have a voice on campus and feel comfortable on campus. And some universities in Florida may to some extent skew conservative, or perhaps skew very conservative, but progressive voices are able to make their voices heard and are able to bring their ideas to campus as well. And so that's why I'm very concerned about what I see as uses of political power to impose a different orthodoxy, rather than use of political power to fight against any form of orthodoxy at any university.
Yeah, that's an important distinction. So we have this sort of development of ideas that resulted in what some people call grievance studies at universities, or humanities literally, or in social sciences, not having a single conservative. I think Steven Pinker, you said recently that only 3% of Harvard professors are define themselves as conservative. That's probably all. They're probably all in the economics department, and there's probably zero in the sociology department or other ethnic studies departments and the like. And that seems to me something very hard to overcome. Now, I have some ideas, and I'm sure you've thought about it as well. But I want to just hit on one. We have this concept of academic freedom that is designed to protect professors in expressing themselves. Yet it seems to me that we don't have a defined concept of academic freedom for students, where students get to challenge ideas. And so a student who would attend one of these classes, these grievance studies classes, and has heterodox views and wants to express them, could easily and probably would be shut down. I mean, sometimes you just have to read the syllabus and you know that such ideas are not welcome. You don't even have to go to class to discern that. If a state, I know we're talking about states here, not private universities really, who says, look, we want to make sure that there's a multiplicity of views heard in any classroom. We're not there to punish the professor for his or her opinion, but we want to make sure that a student going to any class has the right to express them. Is that a form of a student academic freedom? Should we grant that? And could a university monitor classes, not again to punish the professor for having an opinion, but rather to ensure that a multiplicity of views were heard in the classroom?
Well, certainly, look, I think it's an abuse of the power granted to you in the classroom to grade people on the basis of their political views. And this is a problem that I know from students is very real. I take that seriously when I teach, emphasizing verbally again and again and trying to show in the way that I respond to what students say in the classroom that I encourage people to have views different from my own. I always say, look, I would much rather that you make an interesting point that I disagree with than that you parrot back my views to me in a way that is unthinking or that is rote. I'm going to grade the quality of your argument, not whether I agree with you. And one of the ways that I say this and I say this again, and students don't quite trust me on that. They start to trust me when they see that I push back against all views, that whatever views people present in the classroom, I say, all right, that's very interesting. What about this? What about this counter argument? Isn't there a flaw here in your argument? And then they see if I sort of do that in an equal opportunity way with different kind of views. They're like, oh, okay. Like he will actually push back against a view that perhaps he broadly holds when it's not presented well. And he's going to do that in the same respectful way for a view that perhaps he doesn't agree with. So that's a way of trying to demonstrate that in the classroom. I know from students that they have these concerns coming into my class because they have learned through experience that in some classes, I think it's probably a minority of them, but in enough, but many of them have experienced this. They got the message, you blurb back to me what I believe, and you get a good grade. You challenge, the assumptions of this class or the political views that I hold, and it's not going to end well for you. You're going to get a bad grade. I think it's hard to know how exactly to interfere with that because grading is subjective, and you want to minimize the amount of bureaucracy and administrative oversight and so on. But as a principle, to say that it goes, of course, beyond the authority of a teacher in the classroom to reward or punish people for the political views they express, rather than the quality of the argument that they make. And this is something that the university needs to send a very clear message to its faculty and to its teaching assistants about, to make it clear to them that when they say, I'm a scholar activist, that can mean that you're a scholar that also wants to do activism in the world. That's appropriate. But in the classroom, that means that people who disagree with your activist views are going to be treated worse. That is a serious violation of the duties and responsibilities with which the university has entrusted you. I think absolutely that is something that universities need to become more vocal about.
So I interviewed Greg Lukianoff, who's the CEO of FIRE recently, and his view is that we really have to de-bureaucratize universities. And I think that means DEI, but not only DEI. I mean, we have these huge administrative staffs. I don't know if it was
at Yale now, there's more administrators in the whole of the university, to be fair, but there's more administrators at Yale University than there's undergraduate students.
Right. And he cited a figure, $200,000 per student to educate, which on the face of it just seems outrageous. And that's because of these administrative salaries. What is your view on that? I mean, would you, if a university, if there was legislation in your state that supported banning, DEI, or a governor who wanted to issue an executive order, or just an activist university president who wanted to restore sanity, and said, look, we're going to do away the DEI department. We may come up with something different down the line that deals with cooperation or universal values, but right now we're going to get rid of the DEI department. Would you support that?
I don't think I would support it by legislative fiat. If a university president decides to do that for their own institution, I think it's perfectly acceptable. In general, I think we also need more diversity among academic institutions. It's striking to me that we're supposed to have, laboratories of learning or laboratories of democracy, and yet, the top 50 American universities basically all have the same culture, and then there's sort of, a slightly different culture at some of the big state schools and a slightly different culture at whatever. But they all look to each other to such an extent that the institutions are much more similar to them than they should be. I think this problem would be much lesser if there were some universities where there's a very, very strong DEI effort, and other universities that say, no, we do not have a DEI bureaucracy. I think it would be great to have that variety among universities. I do think that two things are legitimate. One is just in general to interrogate the status of university endowments. So for state legislatures or Congress to say, if your endowment exceeds a certain amount of dollars per student, perhaps we're going to tax it, or we're going to look very carefully at whether that's actually still serving a charitable purpose. And we're going to set much stricter rules as to what would be required for these vast endowments to actually be serving a charitable purpose. And then the other thing I would say, at the level of the state that is passing a budget for public universities, is just impose much tougher caps on how much the university is allowed to spend on bureaucracy in general, right? Saying, look, we're giving you X billion dollars in subsidies to educate the students in our, in our country, in our state. We understand that you need to spend money on salaries for faculty members and others. We obviously understand we need some amount of bureaucracy. But you know what? Your bureaucratic expenditure shouldn't be more than whatever it is, 10%. And if it's more than that, then you're forfeiting public funds. That to me would be a more promising thing to do. More broadly speaking, I am worried about the role that the DEI bureaucracy plays on many campuses. I'm worried in part about the way in which they really set the student culture. The first thing you do is to come into an orientation run by those kind of bureaucrats, and they split you into different affinity groups. They educate you about how you're supposed to talk to each other. They tell you which words to use and which words not to use. I think this is also a surrender of their core duties by academic faculty, who should really be setting the tone for the university, and are failing to do that. And the bureaucracy has in part been able to step in because there's a lack of that form of engagement and leadership from the actual faculty that should be at the core of any real university. But then at the same time, I do think that it should be a fight for, to the extent that this bureaucracy exists, what its values are. Is it based on a common enemy epistemology of a world, and one that says that, your identity is set deep down by the group into which you happen to be born, and the way to understand social life is as a struggle between different identity groups, and you have to fight against the others for recognition, for resources, in order to get your own? Or is it a common humanity frame that says, you want to be respectful to others, you want to be tolerant of others, you want to be aware of a variety and diversity of experience among humans, but you can communicate with each other, you can learn from each other, you can inspire each other. The point of a college campus is to have people from these different kind of backgrounds in contact with each other, so that we learn together and we come to see what we share as humans. And then finally, I think some of those things are decisions that are more concrete about what kind of environment to build. A shocking number of universities now offer and encourage students to live in race-segregated dorms. Tell minority students, hey, don't you want to go and live in the Latino house, live in the Black house? I do not think that universities should be offering those kind of race-segregated dorms. It used to be that there's a slightly cruel and unusual habit in the United States that, these often very privileged students have to go and share a literal room with a stranger for the first year. I don't quite understand why, Americans that love comfort so much have settled on this strange social norm. It's not the case in England, for example, where you have very crammed rooms, but you have separate rooms. But if you do, I think it's always been a very smart thing universities did to assign those students randomly, or even to seek out different students and put them together in that environment. And many deep friendships have formed among otherwise perhaps unlikely people as a result. Well, a vast number of universities now allow incoming freshmen to choose their roommates, either because they happen to have gone to the same high school, or because they've met at some local meetup, they've met through social media. And they tend to cluster predictably among much more similar lines of ethnicity, religion, but also socioeconomic status. That, I think, is a mistake. So there's many things beyond sort of the DI bureaucracy that universities can do to either encourage or discourage an atmosphere, context of mutual discovery and mutual friendship rather than mutual enmity.
Couldn't agree with you more. I had a conversation, maybe we'll end on this, with Michael Polyakov. I may get the organization wrong, but he's the longtime CEO of the American Council for trustees and alumni, board of trustees and alumni. And he's a political conservative, I believe he'd characterize himself as that. And he was talking about the need for ideological diversity among the faculty, which is something we've touched upon. And by the time he was done, I sort of asked him a little tongue in cheek, so Michael Polikoff, are you saying you support viewpoint affirmative action in higher education? And he sort of smiled and said, yes, I suppose I do. And this is someone who I would imagine probably is not a big fan of the, racial forms of affirmative action. Let me put that question to you. I mean, do we need ideologically conscious administrators and deans in order to reverse this? I mean, how do you deal with a Harvard if there's only 3% conservatism, and even fewer than that in the humanities? How do you change the current ideological atmosphere on campus with such a lopsided ideological, representation on the faculty?
There's a nice distinction that I think originally was made by the British Nigerian writer Ralph Leonard between racism blindness and race blindness. We don't want to be racism blind, right? Obviously, racism exists in our society and influences outcomes to a significant extent, and we want to study that and be on the lookout for that and take action to counteract discrimination. That does not mean that we necessarily want institutions to make the decisions about how to treat you explicitly on the basis of race. The goal should be to eventually have a society where we don't do that. I would say that something similar applies in this context, right? If it just so happens that your local golf club hasn't ever had a single Black member, well, perhaps that's an indication that there's something fishy going on here, right? That doesn't seem like it could be the outcome of truly race-blind principles. That doesn't mean that, its demographic representation has to be exactly equal to the local city. All kinds of reasons why that might end up not being the case. I don't believe that what the African-American Marxist scholar Adolf Reed Jr. calls racist paritarianism, a certain kind of form of equity, should be the guiding principle of society. So you have, exactly the same number of Jewish NBA players as in the general population, and exactly the same amount of accountants from each ethnic group. Perhaps Jews are going to be a little bit overrepresented there, and that's fine, right? In the same way, I think there are some reasons why conservatives may be less likely to end up in academia. Perhaps they value professions where you can make more money more. I mean, most academics could probably make more money in different kinds of professions. Perhaps conservatives tend to value money more for various reasons, right? That's fine, right? I certainly don't think that the Harvard faculty needs to be 29% conservative, because in the US population, 29% of people consider themselves conservative. But when there's 2.5 conservatives across the entire humanities and social sciences at Harvard, something else seems to be going on. And we should take action against the forms of explicit and implicit discrimination that have clearly led to the disappearance of conservatives in those fields. So I don't think you have to say we need affirmative action for conservatives. I think you can say, there's good reason to think that conservatives are not welcome in these departments, in these professions, and we should take action to ensure that qualified conservatives actually are able to be hired when they are the most qualified candidate for the job, which I believe is not the case at present.
Right. Lukianoff also said to me one of the best programs he's seen was at Dartmouth, when they were pairing conservative professors and liberal professors to teach a class. And I thought that was brilliant. And I mentioned that to another guest on a podcast who said to me, well, how many universities really have enough conservative academics to go along? And if they did, that means there's going to be no conservative research, because it's all going to be in teaching these many classes that there are not enough people to go around in. So it seems to me you could be a little bit affirmative in your approach in hiring, just to make sure that you have people who are able to teach those classes. But Yascha, this has been very informative and thoughtful, as I knew it would be. And I really appreciate all your work that you're doing. I think Persuasion is an amazing publication, and I always look forward to getting my emails and reading it. And then, I'm glad we were able to talk. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Really, really enjoyed this conversation. Let's talk again soon.
Thanks a million. Thank you for tuning in to The Contrarian. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Don't forget to rate our podcast on Apple and Spotify. Stay connected with us on social media for more updates. Until next time, keep challenging.